if you recall from earlier in the video, we talked about how that you can have multiple scenarios underneath one project name. So if you look at the top of IT Guru, you can see that your project is still called last name underscore lab 1, but our scenario is single network. What we want to do is duplicate this scenario and modify it so that we can have a separate experiment to run. So what we want to do is click Scenarios, click Duplicate Scenario, and go ahead and rename this one to Networks. Click OK. So now we've duplicated the scenario, and if you want to switch between scenarios, just go to Scenario, switch to Scenario, and then you can put the check next to whatever scenario you want to work with. In our case, we only have two, and go ahead and leave it on 2 networks because we're going to be modifying this one. So now let's add an additional network to attach to our server. Let's go ahead and use the Rapid Configuration tool again to do this. Go ahead and go into Star Topology. Again, use the Cisco switch as the center node. Use SMINT workstation for the periphery node, but instead of 30, let's just do 15 this time. And for our link model, stick with 10 base T. Go ahead and leave the radius at 20 just like we did before, but now you'll see that we want to modify our placement a little bit. So we could probably fit them in at around 75, 25. Excuse me, that would be 25, 75. So let's do that. X25, Y75, and click OK. There we go. We have another star topology created in our network. So now we have 2 networks, but we need to join them together so that they can communicate with the server. And to do that, we have a router in our palette. So go ahead and put down a Cisco 2514 router into the scenario. Now what we need to do is use the 10 base T connection to connect the router to both switches. Now both networks are able to communicate through the router to the server. So now what we want to do is basically run the same experiment again, now that we've increased the size of the traffic that's going to be going through our network. You'll remember before that we chose individual statistics on the server and globally to monitor Ethernet load, and Ethernet delay. So let's run the scenario. Go to Simulation, configure discrete event simulation, 0.5 hours for 30 minutes of runtime, and click Run. Once the simulation's ended, click Close. And now we're going to do something a little different. Before, to see our statistics, we right-clicked and clicked View Results. And now that we have another scenario that's run, click Compare Results, and we'll compare our results of this experiment with the one that we just did. Right-click the server, compare results, expand Ethernet, and click Load. Now we see 2 sets of information here. Go ahead and click Show to open the full graph. And you can see up at the top there's a little color code to show you which scenario's stats you're looking at. In blue we had our original statistics. If you remember, the spike went up to about 5,500 bits per second, and it evened out around 2,500 bits a second or so on average. Now you can see that our network with additional workstations in our router, initial traffic spikes up almost to 9,500 bits per second and tapers off at somewhere around 4,000 bits per second. But as you can see, the traffic isn't really varying too much here. The bits per second are somewhat stable, and this is a good sign. It probably indicates a more or less stable network. Go ahead and click delete when you go to close the window. Click close, and now let's take a look at the delay in our network. Right click anywhere in the open space, click compare results, expand Ethernet under global statistics and check delay. Go ahead and click show to expand the full graph, and you can see here that actually between the two experiments the delay is almost identical. It rises up quickly from underneath 3 milliseconds and tapers off at about 4 milliseconds and pretty much stays that way for the entirety of the experiment. So it's safe to say from our results that even though we added an additional network of 15 workstations, the overall Ethernet delay in our network is essentially stable, and it's doing okay. If we were to add additional networks or even more workstations, it might be a different situation as we begin to overload the server with that traffic. But overall, the setup that we have is pretty stable, and it's a pretty successful series of networks. Go ahead and click delete and close that. So that pretty much wraps up lab number 1. Hopefully throughout the course of this lab you've been able to take a look at ITGRU, navigate through some of the menus, see how to configure a simulation, how to gather some statistics from that simulation, how to configure application traffic to run in the scenarios that you make, and how to duplicate your scenario so that you can modify it and compare your stats between your two scenarios, or even more. It's a pretty open-ended piece of software, and you can do a lot with it. And throughout the course of these labs, we'll be doing a lot of interesting things to learn about networking, and we're going to utilize ITGRU for those exercises. So thanks for watching this one, and go ahead, if you're confident, move on to lab 2.